Hey everyone, we are on chapter 7 of the book of Esther. If you want to go back and watch the previous chapters 1 through 6, they are on my channel. I'm going to go ahead and read all of chapter 7, and then we're going to go back and study this out verse by verse. So, Esther chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So a lot has happened in chapter 7. Let's read verses 1 through 2 again. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. So again, the king is asking Esther, what is your request? So remember in chapter 5, whenever Esther goes to the king unannounced and he extends his scepter to her, he wants to know what her request is. Why has she risked her life to come to him unannounced? Except she doesn't tell what she really wants. She invites him and Haman to a banquet. So that banquet the first banquet was the day before the events of chapter 7. At that banquet, the king has asked her, What is your request? And again, she delays, and she says, If you come tomorrow to the second banquet, I will tell you what I really want. So he has asked her again. It's the second banquet, and he is assuming that she is going to tell him this time, finally, what her real request is. So let's look at verses 3 and 4. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. So let's think just a minute about Esther and her leading up to this moment. So we know a lot of things have happened in the past few days. She has fasted for 3 days. She goes before the king unannounced. She has already had one banquet with him and Haman, and she has had to wait until the next day to have the second banquet. So we know a lot about what had happened the night before with the king and Haman. Haman has built the gallows for Mordecai. The king had a sleepless night and had the chronicles read to him. Haman had to publicly honor Mordecai. So we know what they were going through, but we don't really know what was going on with Esther at the time. So, these are things we can only imagine because the Bible doesn't tell us what Esther was doing. But I just wonder, was she nervous? This was going to be the day that she does finally tell the king that his right-hand man has plotted to assassinate her people. And everything is leading up to this moment. And I just wonder if she possibly saw that Mordecai was being honored by Haman. And if she did, it would be more of a confirmation to her that the Jews would be lifted up and Haman would fall. And I like to think that she did see that. I like to think that she did have a confirmation by seeing Mordecai being honored by Haman that everything was going to be okay whenever she made this request to the king. And there's no way to know that for sure, but it just seems like it would happen, that she saw Mordecai being honored for his good deeds and that Haman had to be the one to do it. And when we have moments like that, whenever we know God is on our side, but we're able to see it and to have that confirmation, to have that promise kind of given to us again, it really gives us a courage to make our requests known. And I'm sure that even if that didn't happen, Esther was praying and seeking the Lord to have that courage to ask the king to save her people. So, if we look at verses 3 again, she says, "If I had found favor in thy sight, O king." There is many times throughout the book of Esther that she says, "If I had found favor in thy sight." And many times it tells us that she did find favor. So Esther 2:8, Esther was chosen along with other maidens to go to Shushan the palace. She had favor then. Esther 2:9, Esther pleases Haggai, the keeper of the women. Esther 2:15, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. Esther 2:16, the king chooses Esther to be his queen. Esther 5:2, the king holds out his scepter to her. Esther 5:8, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. So there's many, many times that Esther was given favor. Actually, I said Esther 5:8. Okay, let me read that. "If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and will do tomorrow as the king hath said." So several times that Esther has found favor in the sight of the king. And if we look at verse 4, she says, "For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish." So she is grouping herself together there. She's saying me and my people, I and my people. And whenever she says I and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish, she is quoting of the decree in Esther 3:13. So let's go read that. "And the letters were sent by post into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey." So she says if they had only been sold for money, she wouldn't have even troubled the king. And it says the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. So Haman, the enemy, could not pay you enough to make up for what the kingdom would lose with so many subjects being gone. So she has plainly told the king, I and my people are going to be destroyed. And by using those same words that the decree has stated, she is identifying herself as a Jew, and that her and her people, the Jews, are going to be slain and destroyed. So let's look at verse 5. "Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so?" The king wants to know who has done this. Even though the king is the one who makes the decrees, he's blaming someone else. Okay, let's look at verse 6. "And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen." So Esther reveals Haman plotted to kill all Jews, the king's second in command, his right-hand man, the man that the king trusted with his signet ring and trusted him to do what seemeth good. The one he had decreed that everyone bow down to him. The king had decreed that that everyone had to bow down to him. So this is like saying to the king, the man you trusted most wants your wife dead. And the king, of course, was not taking any responsibility. He's saying, who has done this? And Haman, who was once proud, is now afraid. And I could just see, there's a couple of them actually, but there's a really good painting, I can't remember who it's by, that shows Esther just in that moment, like pointing at Haman. And it's so dramatic, it looks great. Just Google it, there's probably more than one. But, I could just see her saying, like, she's really getting her point across. She's saying the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And she is, like, really laying it on thick, Okay, and Haman, of course, is afraid. So, verse 7, and the king arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So, it says that the king is so angry he walks away. And we see Haman, he uses this opportunity to plead with Esther. Verse 8, then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So the bed that they're talking about in verse 8 is not an actual bed like we think. It's actually like a lounging couch, and a lot of Persians during that time would eat on like a lounging couch. That's where they would have their banquets, and where it's talking about the banquet of wine, that's the wine that they ate after the wine that they drank after some of the food that they ate. But one commentary states that it was Persian custom that no man could get within 7 steps of any woman that belonged to the king. And this was probably true because we know from reading Esther that the king kept his wives and concubines away from everyone else. They had like a house of just for the women. So he says, will he force the queen also before me? Now, the king probably does not think that Haman was trying to force himself upon Esther right there in the middle of all this. But with him saying that, he was showing everyone what he thought of Haman. Because if that Persian custom was true, Haman touched the queen. He was down at her, I can just see him like down on his knees begging Esther, like for his life. He has went way too close to the queen, the king's wife, one of his women, and he is touching her, and they know that that is a death sentence pretty much. And by the king saying, will you also force her in front of me? His fate is sealed, because it says, as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So as soon as the king said that, Haman was a goner. And it's interesting to think about that same day, Haman has went home in shame and mourning, covering his own face because he had to publicly honor Mordecai, and now he's having his face covered for him. And that meant pretty much his fate was sealed. He was to be executed. So let's look at verses 9 and 10. It says, and Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So Haman was killed on the very instrument that he had built for Mordecai. So gallows means tree in Hebrew. Many historians believe that this wasn't a gallows like we think of, like those old Western movies with a noose. It was probably a long pole with a stake driven through the person's body. So many different versions of the Bible will say that he was impaled. So at any rate, this was 75 feet high, and it was attached to a wall or a building of some sort because it was so high. The excessive height was so everyone could see Mordecai suffer. And it says it standeth in the house of Haman, so it was probably in Haman's own court or garden. Now, if we look at Esther 5 and 14, it says, "And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made." So he was happy that the gallows were going to be made to hang Mordecai on. And I can just imagine that if it was standing in the house of Haman, it was on his property, on his estate, he was watching it being built, thinking, my enemy Mordecai is going to be hanged on that. Hanged, impaled, whichever. And then to see it turn around, and just the fear that would be going through Haman, knowing like he is going to meet his end on the very instrument, the very device that he wanted to see Mordecai on. He's actually going to be the one to perish on that. And if we look at Psalm 7, 14 through 16, it says, "Behold, he travaileth with iniquity, and hath conceived mischief, and brought forth falsehood. He made a pit, and digged it, and is fallen into the ditch which he made. His mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down upon his own pate." So that describes everything that just happened with Haman. He dug his own pit. He built his own gallows. And that is, some would say, poetic justice, coincidence, whatever you want to call it. It is not coincidence. He dug his own pit. He dug his own grave. He built his own gallows. And because he was a proud and foolish man, he dies on those gallows. Now, I want to go back to verse 9. It says, "And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai." One of the chamberlains, after they covered Haman's face, has said, actually, there's already some gallows made. Haman has built some gallows to hang Mordecai on. And the king said, hang him thereon. So in Esther 1 and 10, it mentions this same man, Harbona, one of the king's chamberlains, and that they were to bring Vashti the queen before the king. So we know that this chamberlain in particular did the king's bidding. He brought forth people for the king. Now, if you'll go back to 6 and 14, earlier that day, whenever Haman had been talking to Zeresh and his friends, and he was telling them that the gallows I built for Mordecai, the king, I didn't even get to ask the king to hang Mordecai because I had to honor Mordecai. On 6 and 14 it says, "And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared." It doesn't say what chamberlains came to get Haman, but I'm thinking one of them has to be this Harbona, because he goes to get Haman to bring him to the banquet, and he overhears that the gallows were made for Mordecai, because they were talking about that. It says, "And while they were yet talking, the chamberlains came to get Haman." So Harbona has overheard that Haman has built these gallows for Mordecai. And this was after the public honoring of Mordecai. So Harbona says, "The gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman has made for Mordecai, who has spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman." So we know Haman he probably is thinking so many things at that moment. Why did I make these gallows? Why did I say it where this chamberlain could hear me? Now I have to die on this very gallows that I made for my enemy. And that is just what happens when you mess with God's people, I guess. So we will be reading and discussing chapter 8 of Esther soon, and I hope you enjoy this, and I invite you to study this out for yourself. And if I have ever said anything that's not correct, forgive me. I'm only human, but I just love getting in the Word and trying to visualize things, and trying to figure out like what's going on behind the scenes. So I love Esther, and I love that you all have joined me for this Bible study series.